On January 18th, 31st, the Church remembers the Venerable Kirill and Maria, the parents of Saint Sergius of Radonezh. Some have said, perhaps Father Thomas Hopko, or maybe someone else, that the Church has been in monastic captivity since at least the Middle Ages. This statement may be strong, but it is not altogether incorrect. Perhaps one of the aspects of the life of the Church where this captivity is particularly evident is in whom she chooses to canonize among her saints. Very few of those glorified by the Church happen to be married couples, and of those who are, fewer still treated one another as spouses rather than as brother and sister. But this is not because the married state is not compatible with sanctity. Christianity has never taught such a thing. This dearth of inspirational examples became evident in the early 2000s when Saints Peter and Phroneo of Murom were chosen as the patron saints of family life in the Russian Church, a choice which is quite curious to say the least, but far be it from us to question decisions of people much wiser and more pious, and this story deserves a separate treatment in a post of its own. But 300 kilometers from Murom near Rostov, there lived another married couple, Kirill and Maria. Some have said, perhaps Father Thomas Hopko, or maybe someone else, that the Church has been in monastic captivity since at least the Middle Ages. This statement may be strong, but it is not altogether incorrect. Perhaps one of the aspects of the life of the Church where this captivity is particularly evident is in whom she chooses to canonize among her saints. Very few of those glorified by the Church happen to be married couples, and of those who are, fewer still treated one another as spouses rather than as brother and sister. But this is not because the married state is not compatible with sanctity. Christianity has never taught such a thing. This dearth of inspirational examples became evident in the early 2000s when Saints Peter and Phroneo of Murom were chosen as the patron saints of family life in the Russian Church, a choice which is quite curious to say the least, but far be it from us to question decisions of people much wiser and more pious, and this story deserves a separate treatment in a post of its own. But 300 kilometers from Murom, near Rostov, there lived another married couple, Kirill and Maria. Kirill did not fight dragons, as did Peter of Murom. Perhaps by the end of the 13th century, there were no more dragons left to fight, or perhaps their natural habitat did not stretch into the Principality of Rostov. Instead, Kirill occupied himself with a far less glamorous task of helping the Prince of Rostov to manage his relationship with the Golden Horde. Those were very difficult times. The Mongols raided the Principality of Rostov repeatedly throughout the first quarter of the 14th century. In order to prevent some of the raids, the princes and their noblemen traveled to the Khans with tribute. Kirill took part in these embassies. Additionally, several of those years had a very poor harvest. By the early 1330s, Kirill's family had lost almost everything they had and decided to move to Radonezh in the Principality of Moscow. The reason for the move was quite simple. Economic refugees from Rostov were allowed to not pay taxes in Radonezh for the first several years after resettlement. Through all of these difficulties, Kirill and his wife Maria led lives pleasing to God and were honest before God and men. The pious couple had 3 sons, Stefan, Bartholomew, and Peter, and a daughter Anna. Kirill and Maria raised their sons to love God and devoted much effort to teaching them literacy. In Radonezh, Stefan and Peter got married, but their middle brother, Bartholomew, had his heart set on a monastic life. Kirill and Maria asked that he wait to enter a monastery that he might care for them on account of their poverty and illness. Bartholomew dutifully agreed to stay and care for his aging parents. Soon, however, Stefan's wife died, and he was the first one to enter a monastery near Radonezh. Stefan's 2 children went to live with his brother Peter. This monastery had 2 communities, one for men and another for women. Kirill and Maria both entered the monastery after Stefan. The 2 brothers, Stefan and Bartholomew, were able to continue caring for their parents until their death. When Kirill and Maria died, they were buried at the monastery, where their relics rest until this day. Bartholomew convinced Stefan to go into the forests near Radonezh and try a life of strict asceticism. The 2 brothers built a couple of monastic cells and a chapel in honor of the Most Holy Trinity. In his monastic life, Bartholomew became known as Sergius, the founder of the Trinity Sergius Monastery. Stefan did not stay in the forest for very long. Whether because life there was too harsh, or for some other reason, he left the wilderness and went to Moscow, where he eventually became close to the court of the Grand Prince. Life near the center of political power, however, had its own disadvantages for a monk. Dmitry Merezhkovsky once expressed this sentiment through the words of Elder Ephraim, addressed to the novice poemen in the novel The Death of the Gods. "It is time to go to the desert, my brother. It is better to listen to the howling of jackals and lions than to that which we heard today in Caesar's palace. Oh, my sweet child, blessed are those who speak not. Blessed are those who have guarded themselves with the wall of the silence of the desert, impenetrable to quarrels of church teachers. Blessed are those who have understood the non-entity of words. Blessed are those who quarrel not. Blessed is he who pries not the mysteries of God, but sings before thy face, O Lord, as a lyre." Stefan took his youngest son John, who was then 12 years old, and returned to Sergius's monastery. At the request of his elder brother, Sergius tonsured John a monk with the name Theodore. Later, Theodore became an archbishop and founded St. Simon's Monastery in Moscow. This monastery stood for 6 centuries, from the 14th century until 1929, when the Soviet government demolished most of the buildings with explosives in order to build a culture center of the proletariat. The few remaining structures were eventually returned to the church in 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The monastery built by Saint Sergius still stands and is a major center of monastic life for the Russian Church. It also houses the Moscow Theological Seminary and Academy. Almost nothing is known about Peter, the youngest son of the Venerable Kirill and Maria. Some say that Peter's wife was named Catherine, and that they had a son named Matthew. Most likely, they lived a quiet and pious life. The Venerable Kirill and Maria had a hard life. They did not fight dragons, as did Saint Peter, or know any special secrets of folk medicine, as did Saint Phroneo. They suffered invasions of the Mongols, hunger, and illness. But through all of these hardships, they remained faithful to each other and raised pious and God-loving children, one of whom, Bartholomew Sergius, blessed Prince Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow for the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. Dmitry defeated a large Mongol army led by Beylerbey Mamai, which marked a turning point in the Mongol domination over the Rus. A century later, another Moscow prince, Ivan III, called the Great, put the final end to the Mongol occupation of Rus. For those wishing to live a pious Christian life in the married state, Saint Kirill and his venerable wife Maria offer a holy example worthy of emulation. By their prayers for us and for our children, may the all-merciful God abundantly bless our families. Share Phroneo. Last but not least, if you enjoy Phroneo, please share it with your friends and relations. And if you may be so inclined, please consider supporting this project by becoming a paying subscriber. It is still only $5 per month, far less than what you would have to pay to a Mongol Khan